So I'm home for spring break and decided I wanted to design and build my own foosball table to bring back to college. I've always loved designing and building and thought this would be a great way to create something my friends and family can get lots of use out of. I started by drawing out a simple design plan along with the sizes of materials I needed. Then I drafted them on a 3D modeling app for my iPad. I wasn't super familiar with this app, but it allowed me to get a good idea of how I was going to put this table together. I've made several projects like this in the past. This is just the first one I decided to film. So if you're new to this channel, make sure you subscribe and let me know if you want to see more videos just like this one. I started by using 1x12 standard pine boards to cut the panels that will be used as the sides of the foosball table. Ideally, I'd be using a miter saw, but I was very limited with the tools I had, so I made crosscuts using a circular saw and a guide to keep the cuts as straight as possible. It took a little bit longer, but actually ended up working out just fine. Next, I drilled the holes where the player rods will sit, so I had to make the holes big enough to fit bearings and allow the players to move freely. I also drilled slightly larger holes at the center of the boards where the ball will drop onto the field during play. I have plastic inserts that'll fit into these later. Next, I cut 2x2 furring strips and screwed them into the boards from the inside so that the screws won't be visible from the outside of the table. These are what will hold the actual playfield itself, so I really took my time to make sure they were as level as possible. Then I sanded and stained the interior of these pieces using a dark gray wood stain. I let the stain sit for 10 minutes before wiping the excess off, then lightly sanding some more. As a side note, all I had were screws for this project, so I made sure to pre-drill holes before screws to prevent the wood from splitting, especially on the smaller pieces. After cutting out panels for the goal area, I measured out exactly where I wanted the goals to be, carefully cut out the slots with a jigsaw, and used a Dremel to clean up the edges. I repeated this process twice, and fastened each panel with a second to form L pieces which will sit at the ends of the table. Then it was time to make the framing which would support the playfield from underneath using more furring strips. The playfield was 3/4 inch MDF that I actually had pre-cut at the hardware store because I didn't have a table saw. I used several light coats of black spray paint to cover the surface of the field. I wanted to do this before I had the table assembled so I wouldn't have to worry about painting around other pieces later. I laid out the frame and drilled it in from underneath so that the screws won't be visible from the outside. Next, it was time to assemble the side walls that I made earlier to the playfield framing. What you see is actually the assembly flipped upside down so I could easily screw these pieces in from underneath. After turning the table right side up, my next step was attaching the goal pieces. To help keep my spacing consistent, I temporarily placed the end panels on both ends of the table, then clamped them down to ensure everything was flush. I then pre-drilled each hole and screwed the goal pieces in place. I didn't screw the end panels in yet because I still needed to assemble the ball catch mechanism which would be attached from the inside. After the goals were in place, I removed the end panels so I could add some extra screws from the underside for more strength. Next, it was time to put together the ball catch. I couldn't find standard dimensions for the slots, so I just designed them to look as close as possible to photos of other foosball tables. I wasn't sure how I wanted to cut them out, and again, I was limited to the tools I had, but I decided to start by drilling holes in each corner, then using a jigsaw to do the rest. I was actually pretty happy with how it turned out. The most difficult part of this project was ripping down the 1x12s into thinner panels with a circular saw. I really took my time to ensure these cuts were straight, and then I cut them to length. A table saw would have made this job much easier. These are what will be attached to the back side of the end panels to guide the ball into the slot after scoring a goal. After all the pieces were cut out, I set them up and clamped them together before screwing them in place. Then I lined up each mechanism with a slot on the end pieces before driving screws in. Now that these assemblies were complete, I could attach them to the rest of the table. I used a hammer to tap these pieces in place before drilling and screwing them in. Even though I tried my best to avoid putting screws in from the outside, there were a few places where screws were still visible, but I covered them up with wood filler, then used a putty knife to evenly cover the holes. In this case, it's better to overfill the holes because you can always remove material later. After I made sure all the surfaces were completely dry, I lightly sanded them until they were really smooth and wiped off extra sawdust with a damp cloth. I hadn't yet stained the outer surfaces of the sides or end panels because I knew I'd be screwing into them during the assembly, so I wanted to wait until after the table was put together to make sure I could cover all the screws before applying more stain. I wanted a way to add some depth to the appearance of the table while staying consistent with a rustic look. I used a Dremel to cut 4 aluminum trimmings that would cover the length of each corner. This was actually my first time using a Dremel to cut metal, and I was pleasantly surprised with how well it worked. Doing this did create some sharp edges, but I was easily able to fix that using a filing bit. Once these pieces were cut out, I used a spade bit to sink holes where I'd be placing the screws to fasten them to the table. Then I went over the holes with sandpaper to smoothen the surfaces. I decided to cover these corner pieces with several coats of gloss black spray paint to match the playfield, and I was extremely happy with how this ended up looking. I was having trouble deciding what I wanted to do for the legs. I thought about using black piping, but I had a hard time finding the exact sizes I needed. Instead, I cut down 4x4 pressure treated posts that fastened into the corners of the table using bolts. The circular saw actually wasn't big enough to cut all the way through these pieces, so I had to cut one side, flip it over, then cut it again. Then I clamped all 4 legs together and sanded the ends until they were completely level. To contrast the gray exterior panels while matching the corners and the playfield, I painted the legs with several coats of black spray paint, keeping all of these coats pretty light to help prevent dripping. After that, I went over them with a few coats of spray clear coat just to help add some extra protection and prevent the legs from getting scratched. Next, it was time to start putting everything together. At this point, I was ready to attach the legs to the rest of the table. After pre-drilling holes at each corner, I used 1/4-inch bolts with threaded inserts and drove them in with a socket wrench. This way, if I ever needed to remove the legs, I could take out the bolts, but the inserts would stay in place. Now, I was ready to assemble the individual pieces and hardware that will actually turn this into a working foosball table. I was able to find most of these pieces on Amazon for reasonable prices, but if you wanted to work more on a budget, you can definitely find parts on Craigslist or use parts from old tables. Since all my measurements were standard sizes, it will be easy to replace parts if anything gets lost or broken. Thank you guys so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate it if you give it a thumbs up to let me know. I love doing projects like this, so make sure you subscribe if you want to see more videos like this one. Also, let me know in the comment section what types of videos you'd like to see in the future. Thanks again for watching. Until next time.